Good evening, everyone. This is AGK, the president of Thai Silicon Valley. Better, I'd like to call myself volunteer in chief. So it's great to have this monthly series that we have on my story to share. When we have, fortunately, we have excellent speakers who share their experiences, and that's the session that you all have signed up for today. But before we get there, I want to give a few minutes for those of you who know about TIE and who don't know about TIE. We have been an organization that supports entrepreneurs and fosters entrepreneurship. And we've been around since 1992. And the idea is to support entrepreneurs in multiple ways. One with a lot of learning or education kind of activities, make different type of introductions and connections. Another one is mentorship. Another one is a system with investments and all that. So these are the pillars of TIE, and been programs like My Story are very, very important. We all can pick up one or two nuggets from this, and then try to implement it in our own way. So one request I have is each of you please do take some nuggets away today. TICON is coming up soon. It's on May 6th, 7th, and 8th. And if you have not registered, please go ahead and register. And also, being virtual, we made the conference free for all the attendees. So over the 3 days, we've got phenomenal lineup of speakers, grand keynote speakers, track keynote speakers, as well as other programs for you to, boot camp, VC Connect, Mentor Connect, and programs like that, TIE 50. So if you're an eligible TIE 50 company and you want to apply, please do that also, because it just increases the awareness about your company, and then the recognition is very valuable. There are many companies who have been TIE 50 awardees in the past have now had phenomenal exits. So looking forward to all of you at TICON pretty soon, ticon.org, and please look up and then register. So with that, let me introduce Naveen Bisht. He's been, championing the My Story event for us, right from planning all the way through execution. Naveen is our, go-to person. And like all of us, he's also an amazing volunteer. He has served TIE in multiple different ways. He's a charter member. He's been served on the board, and he's been a convener of TICON, and then now he's doing this for us. So thank you, Naveen. So Naveen is a serial entrepreneur, and he is right now the CEO of Trika. I may be saying it right, but wrong. But anyway, please correct me if I'm wrong, Naveen. And then, of course, the way this whole program works is I'll let Naveen explain how we're going to enjoy this session with Dr. Anne-Marie. So Naveen, please take it away.
Thank you, AGK. Really appreciate your intro. It's a good evening, everyone over here in the West Coast and in the Western part, and good morning to many of you who probably have joined from India and other parts of the world. We are really excited to have you here. As AGK mentioned, the idea of My Story was to have entrepreneurs who have been highly successful in their journey share their wisdom. As many of you, those who are aspiring entrepreneurs or those who are running their startups right now, know that we have a lot of information available, which is about how to write a business plan, how to start your company legally, etc. All those resources are there. But even with all those resources, still there are subtle nuances, and I call it the nuggets, which every entrepreneur goes through in their journey in order to make their company successful, either selling it to a large company or taking it public. So those nuances are the ones where in our monthly event, which is My Story, these entrepreneurs share, and those could be really helpful in having you go through your own entrepreneurial journey. So today we have also an amazing speaker. So before as we know, before this current crisis for last 1 year that we all have been experiencing, I call it the adventurous time. Many of the folks resisted the adoption of digital transformation, and but what this pandemic demanded was it demanded virtual delivery of nearly every experience, including the way we learn. So how do you create a leading AI-based AI-based and cloud-based services offering for learning and upskilling services for education, K-12 universities and businesses? This is what Dr. Marie Sastry has done by founding Amesite and also having it publicly listed on NASDAQ under the symbol AMST. Amesite's mission is to improve the way the world learns, and it's passionate about understanding the needs of learners, the teachers, and the students, and build products that deliver for each and every one. Prior to this, Dr. Sastry was founder and CEO of Shakti, which was recognized as one of MIT's 50 smartest companies back in 2015, and was also at the same year acquired by Dyson for $90 million. And not only that, Dr. Sastry was invited to the White House in 2015 to be recognized for her technology entrepreneurship and meet with President Barack Obama. Her technology and business works has been published in many magazines, including Forbes, Fortune, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, USA Today, New York Times, and also on the cover of Inc. Prior to starting her companies, she was Arthur F. Thurnow Professor, which is University of Michigan's highest teaching honor for 17 years. She was tenured and promoted early and has over 100 publications and over 100 patents and filings. And she has also been highly active in a lot of philanthropical and nonprofit organizations. She holds a PhD and MS from Cornell University and BS from University of Delaware, in all in the areas of mechanical engineering. So without taking too much of thrill from her story, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Marie Sastry now to share her exciting, amazing, and colorful journey. And also, before that, please make sure you write up your questions you want to ask her over here, and we'll try to cover as many as possible. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Naveen. I appreciate it. And thank you, AGK. I really appreciate being here tonight and being around all these people who are trying to change the world. Let me share my screen. And I brought a presentation, but I'll try to keep my remarks relatively short so that you can ask any questions you like, and hopefully I can be helpful. It's such a thrill to be here. So right now I'm CEO of a company called Amesite, as Naveen had said, my friend and colleague and partner Naveen, and thank you for the kind introduction. Our mission is to improve the way the world learns. I come not so far from my roots in founding this latest company. My parents were both educators. My father was a mathematics professor, and my mother was a first grade teacher in her first job. And they both imparted in me a love of learning. My mom taught me to read before I was yet 3 years old, and my dad showed me how to do a little calculus when I was about 6. And I grew up around the academy, and I grew up around people who were always pushing boundaries and always learning. And so it wasn't a surprise when I got my PhD and entered academic life. It was a little bit more of a surprise when I decided to become an entrepreneur and found a company, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to show some information on my company, and since we're publicly traded on the NASDAQ, this is a requirement of forward-looking statements. So when we talk about startups, it's interesting. It's an anagram for upstarts. It's not surprising. Startups are upstarts. When you decide to start a company, you decide that your idea is so big and so different that it requires its own organization, that it can't fit in something that exists, that it needs to be new. And that really speaks to culture, which I'll say a few words about tonight. But the reality is, when you have the daring to start a new organization in pursuit of a new idea, it does require that you build a culture, and you have to make a lot of decisions, not only about what the culture is and what the ways of working will be among your colleagues, but also who you are as a person. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Ultimately, it's about creating new organizations to create new things, whether those things are products or services. A little bit about my first company. Like Naveen said, I was a professor for a long time. When I was a professor, I started a couple of large research centers. I started a large global graduate program, and I also started a company, Sastry. And this is sort of the timeline of that company. Oh, excuse me. The mission of that company was to realize high energy density solid state battery cells. And at the time, that was very much, as they say, in the tinfoil hat crowd. Solid state battery cells existed, but they were very, very small and very, very low energy density. The important part of that problem, as I saw it, was to make the batteries on cheap equipment. That had not been done. And when you spend a couple of $1 million on a piece of equipment and produce one small battery cell a year, it's not going to get very far. So the challenge problem was, can you make it on cheap equipment? Can you use physical vapor deposition or some other technique to make them at a high rate and make them on cheap equipment? And when I started to think about solid state batteries, the trigger for that was a friend of mine had started a research center. I was running a research center myself, and a friend of mine was running a different research center. And he said, Sastry, we have this problem. We need a very small battery. They were working on a microgas chromatograph, and they need a very small, reasonably high energy density battery cell. And he knew I was working in batteries. And I said, well, maybe go to Radio Shack. He said, no, this is harder than it looks. There's nothing with high enough energy density. So I started to think about that. And my colleague Chai Wei Wong and I, who was first my graduate student, then my postdoc, and then he became a research scientist affiliated with my lab, a very good colleague and friend, started to do some calculations. And it seemed that the only way to execute a battery cell that was very small and very high energy density was to remove all of the excess parts, basically make it solid state, no electrolyte, no extra materials. And it seemed from the calculations that that should be possible. So the first prototype I made was spray paint in my garage just to see, how to get a voltage out of 2 cheaply made layers. And having convinced myself that it was possible, then started to go into the lab and start to execute in a silver zinc technology, which was not high enough energy density, but then decided that it actually needed to be a company. Because when you did the rough math, which I did, more or less an applied mathematician, it was clear that it would require millions and millions of dollars to execute, to have specialized equipment, to have the people who would do high throughput experiments. It would be very, very dissimilar to university research. And so therefore it needed to be a company. I knew people who had started companies, but I had not had any experience in entrepreneurship myself. And early on, I was told, go find a real CEO from a very friendly local VC, which was probably very good advice. I went home that night and I told my spouse that I'd gotten told to go find a real CEO. And I thought it was probably good advice, but I couldn't afford a real CEO. So I had to figure it out for a while. And we both laughed about that. And so I became CEO of my first startup. I was fortunate. I quickly raised $2 million in Series A from Coastal Ventures. And then from there, closed successive funding rounds until ultimately we exited the company. In between that time, we had lots of failures and lots of successes and lots of challenges. In 2009, we made our first working prototypes, and they were absolutely terrible. It wasn't until 2010 that we made anything sort of worthy of note, high enough energy density that looked like it was possible, but we were quite dogged. In 2011, we made better prototypes on more equipment, but by 2013, we knew we had hit a wall, that the equipment we were working on was simply not capable of producing the next step. So we made the decision to shut down all of the equipment in pursuit of a piece of equipment that was very expensive, and pin our hopes on that. Obviously, it was a fairly tense time, but when we did that, from May until August of 2014, we did some very, very dogged process work and got up to 1100 watt hour per liter, which was at the time, we think, a record for energy density in a battery cell. Scientific American covered us and the world came calling. We closed a Series C. And then shortly after, the company that had led the C round, Dyson, made an offer of acquisition, and we accepted. And between that time, after their investment, they had been working together with us in a joint development agreement and gone very, very well. And the engineering teams got along very well, and we were excited to do that. So at about that time, Dyson announced they were building an electric vehicle, which actually was the reason that I had founded the company. So what did I learn from this? And maybe there are some things that would be helpful to the people who are tuned in. And hello and good morning to all the people in India too. I have a team in India, and I regret that I haven't been back to India in over a year, but I look forward to getting back. Outsiders notice disruptive tech first. When you are working on something and you're working around people who think as you do and believe what you believe and share a culture, it's very difficult to look at things orthogonally and say, well, it could be a completely different way. Horses versus cars, cell phones versus landlines, EVs versus IC engine-driven vehicles, and solar and wind versus coal. Innovation that's disruptive rarely comes from inside a company that's a traditional company. And that's another reason that we become entrepreneurs, because we think a new organization has to exist because the culture of that organization does not admit the solutions of the past. In fact, the culture is built around the technology and the mindset that something else has to exist. And that has to be a strong enough belief to sustain through the necessarily difficult times. Energy storage is absolutely one of the top 10, what I think of as world problems. And I encourage entrepreneurs to really think about a problem that's big enough that merits its own company. Battery cells find themselves in everything. Humans like to travel aphysical distances and communicate over aphysical distances. And the only way to do that is to store energy. And batteries are the nearest term way to store renewable energy. And so batteries, to me, were one of those fundamental problems, one of those sort of life on planet Earth changing problems that really merited the years of work and the hard work that we all put into it, Sastry 3. So we persisted. When I started the company, it was conveniently right on the cusp of a very large recession, you may recall, in sort of the 2009 or so timeframe. There were bankruptcies, and they were notable, and they were in clean tech. A number of battery companies and clean tech companies went bankrupt. I like to tell the story of when I was coming to Silicon Valley for a fundraiser and a fundraising trip. And yeah, I was leaving, I live in Michigan, and I was leaving out of Detroit Metro, and the huge TV screens were showing A123's bankruptcy. And A123 is a Michigan-based battery company. It's like, oh no. So I was going from Michigan to Silicon Valley to raise money for batteries. Not the most auspicious timing. I got thrown out of a few lobbies. I'm happy to admit. I tried to raise money from VCs and entities that did not want to put monies into batteries, period, let alone my company. And so, but we persisted, and we had literally a dream that solid state batteries could be realized and recognized. But again, no one had done so. So we had to explain a relatively complex scientific problem, at the same time, explain the connection to markets and so forth. Ultimately, there was light ahead of the tunnel. In about 2012, 13, 14, we started to get recognition because we had been able to demonstrate very high energy density in a battery cell, and we began to win awards. Notably, we won at Sastry 3. We were awarded 8 different workplace excellence awards. That is something I'm very, very proud of. The culture at that company was very strong, and that sustained us. And we made decisions about how to run the company as a team that allowed us to make progress. So the company was ultimately acquired and by Dyson, following a period of work in joint development with Dyson. And it was a very good tie-up. I spent the next couple of years, the first few months, actually tucking my team into Dyson, learning that culture, transitioning, and so forth. And then when I felt that everything was copacetic, I was restless again and decided to start my next company. But the coda to that story was that was exactly the mission, The mission was to execute on solid state batteries, and Dyson had committed to put $1 billion into technology and made good on that promise. So what did I learn? I coached my teams a lot on a few different things. First, everyone matters in the organization. I like to tell my teams that, you know, the custodian in the building determines our success. The frontline technician determines our success. Yes, the PhD determines our success, but so does everybody else. Everybody in the building, in the organization, in some regards, has veto power over the execution. Everyone. And so it's very important to recognize what people bring to the table and recognize the personality differences, the differences in objectives, and respect those. The core technical staff often get the most hallowed ground. They're responsible for the technology and communicating the technical status and needs, and also for training the staff on technology. But without the business and ops staff or outside partners, they cannot execute. The business and ops staff, again, responsible for all kinds of things, including their own training and communicating the business needs. And then finally, outside partners comprise the lion's share of the business. No one creates a company in a vacuum. In fact, at first, your company is mostly outsiders. And then ultimately, that work transitions to people who are part of the company proper. But everyone matters. The key lessons, the core lessons I learned from SACTI 3 are embodied in the principles of my present company, which we call the BEATS. And they are: judgment beats rules, measurement beats conjecture, humility beats arrogance, honesty beats politeness, optimism beats cynicism, passion beats rules, transparency beats manipulation, and growth beats comfort. And I like to pause on growth beats comfort because it's something that's easily missed. Some people think in life that people naturally seek comfort. I've been asked many times, I did okay in my first company. It's like, why aren't you on a beach? Why did you start another company? My answer sort of alternates between I'm high energy and, you know, stupidity. But the real answer is that growth beats comfort. And most people seek growth over comfort. People like to grow. People like to be advancing. And that's very important. In terms of judgment beats rules, when you really respect your colleagues, you'll push them to show good judgment rather than try to codify the entire culture in a thick book of rules. Measurement beats conjectures is obvious. Humility beats arrogance actually gives you the strength to step up after you fail because you can admit your failure. Honesty beats politeness doesn't mean honesty is the opposite of politeness. It means that giving someone direct feedback is a way of advancing them, and it's better than telling a polite lie and not allowing someone else to advance. Optimism beats cynicism is obvious, and anybody who starts a company who's not optimistic should probably pick another line of work. Passion beats cynicism is very important, and of course, transparency always beats manipulation. So why Amesite? Well, after the SACTI 3 part of my journey, I decided to return to education, and part of the reason was the last 10 years in a row, fewer Americans had gone to college, which is a travesty. Also, student debt stood at $1.6 trillion. And in my view, having taught online and run a global graduate program online, and seeing what online had evolved into, online was clearly the nearest term way of educating lots and lots of people, but it was hands down the worst experience on the internet. When you looked at the numbers, this was all pre-pandemic, of course, the global online degree market was enormous, and the global online education market in toto, including enterprise and so forth, was enormous as well. Meanwhile, SaaS businesses were taking over the enterprise, but that had left education behind. So L&D was not part of that. And it seemed obvious to me that the way to make education more accessible was to do one thing, which is improve the user experience. And the way to improve the user experience was through the private sector, was through a SaaS, a SaaS business, a B2B software company that would improve the user experience. And it seemed to me no one was really working on that. The existing so-called LMSs and so forth seemed to be focused on storing data, but not engagement. And there was a mismatch in the academy, which had traditionally been about a culling. So all of us who went to school probably had a professor at some point say to us, look to your left, look to your right at the end of the term, one of you won't be here. And so it had been thought of as a winnowing or a culling rather than a retention. Versus platforms like Spotify and Netflix, which were designed to keep you engaged. Of course, all of social media, but the objectives were different. The objectives were, of course, to keep you there, to sell you things and so forth. So no one had really thought about or was talking about applying those principles to education. But I was quite passionate and remain quite passionate about that, because if you're serious about education, you must expend an enormous energy keeping engagement high. So I was fortunate to be a professor for a long time, but my thinking on this was maybe a little bit different, which is that a lot of professing is around persuading people to learn what you have to say and connecting that to things that are happening. And there's no better way to do that than with AI. It's been very effective in music and entertainment and in social media, but not yet used in education. So in thinking about this, I had done okay on my first company, and I thought perhaps this will be a charitable activity, because I had done philanthropic work, of course, in homelessness and climate change, but it was too expensive. So I decided that it would be another company, but this time a public company, because I wanted to get access to the capital markets, and I wanted to be able to grow something big that had large impact. And that was really how Amesite began following Sastry 3. So Amesite is a platform company, and we're cloud-based platform and content creation services. We provide fully managed services. So we come into an organization and brand to that organization. And we have a unique and very passionate focus on the user experience. On the platform, we've been able to deliver over 98% retention. We brand to our customers. So if anybody wants to visit the website, you're welcome to do so. But we are not only passionate about what we do, but we're passionate about protecting our users and protecting their data as well. So we not only don't sell data to third parties, we don't allow third parties to look at our data. Our mission, again, is to improve the way the world learns. We were founded in 2017. People say, how did you, you're so lucky to be running an online company during pandemic. There's nothing lucky about pandemic at all. I would say the only thing that made us fortunate was that we were big enough and strong enough to be able to help and stand up services during the pandemic. And we couldn't have anticipated it, but the pandemic did accelerate the move online. We closed our first financing in 2018, and we launched our first solutions in 2018 as well. And in 2020, just scarcely 3 years after we were founded, we went public on the NASDAQ. So we've had some key accomplishments. We've won sales. Again, one of the things that's important to me is that we've won now at this company 6 Workplace Excellence Awards, 2 national. And again, the focus on the culture, very, very, very important. And of course, it positions the organization for growth. And it's something I highly recommend spending time on up front. It's also important to know what you do. We surveyed the space, and we thought about everyone being either a potential, irrelevant to what we were doing, or a potential customer or partner. And that's sort of how we look at the world. We look at the world like, how can I partner with you? How can we provide you services? That's one of the reasons that we decided to white label the service, so that we could ultimately serve anybody. When colleagues said, hey, why didn't you go back to the academy, or why went you to university after your successful exit? I answered honestly, I didn't want to run a university. We wanted to run them all better. We wanted to be able to deliver services to anybody. And we're pleased to count universities like Wayne State University and companies like Ford Motor Company as among our customers. The Henry Ford Museum is another customer. So when we looked at the platforms for the future of work, we count ourselves there. If you look at the growth in AI, the growth in online education, and the growth in SaaS, they're all hugely, hugely high potential. And we sit at Amesite in the intersection of all of those. Another piece of advice, bring great colleagues and listen to them. These faces are the faces of my board of directors. They're very experienced. Just a couple of pointers. Barbie Brewer ran talent at Netflix. Mike Losh was the CFO of General Motors. Gil Oman, former and first CEO of the entire University of Michigan Health System. Richard Ogawa, award-winning patent attorney. George Palmer, real estate entrepreneur extraordinaire. Anthony Barquette, another real estate entrepreneur, very, very successful. So the board of directors at Amesite brings a lot of decades of experience in finance, tech, and IP, and people and growth. And my advice is, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this, is form a board that you respect and will listen to, because that way you multiply your impact. And those are the remarks I brought tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions or give any insights I can. Thank you so much again for inviting me.
All right. Thank you, Henry. Really appreciate your sharing your story. So let me start with the first question, and then audience as they're typing up. So one of the articles I was reading on on the web, I guess. So you had mentioned that you were always forward-looking, and as a lifelong mathematician, you turned even food issues into solvable equations when you worked at a restaurant in high school.
I
So
did.
I thought that sounded very interesting. So I thought maybe if you can share that story.
Well, I always like to count things, and I always liked processes that were orderly. And so I always thought about the world in kind of a mathematical way. And if I could improve a process by creating a model or something, I was always very happy about that. So I worked at restaurants when I was a kid, and I would, count trays of chickens, or I would count pots of chili or things like that, and try to optimize processes, move crowds through faster and things. Yeah.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you. So I have the first question from Cameron Dixon. What are your sales pitches to colleges? I understand you believe engagement is important, and I don't disagree, but colleges get paid regardless of how engaged a student is, unless it increases retention.
Mhm. That's our value add. I mean, we have 98% plus retention on the platform, and the ease of use of the platform is one of our claims to fame. It's interesting, although our platform is driven by high technology and AI, and one of the things I like to say is, if it's easy to code, it's hard to use. If it's easy to use, it's hard to code. The Amesite platform was in fact hard to code, but it's very, very easy to use. And so, yeah, no one really wants to hear about all the fancy stuff under the hood. What they really want to hear about is it easy to use? Is it going to be engaging? And that's really what we talk about. When we show people the platform, it's very obvious that it's easy to use and engaging, and the numbers don't lie. But in terms of, the investor-facing message versus the customer-facing message, they're different, because investors and customers care about different things. I hope that helps.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question is from another attendee, Aubrey Aloysius. What are your thoughts on using technology, AI, and machine learning in music education?
Yeah, I think that virtually anything for adults can be taught online. And if you think about it, we consume music online, and we compose and create content online. So there's really anything you can deliver over the internet, you can deliver a learning experience online. It definitely, and interestingly, on our platform, our bots read hundreds of thousands of articles a week and serve up content that's relevant to what's being taught in the experience. And there's always something new happening in every field of endeavor, including music education. So yeah, I think it's a very appropriate use of the technology.
So let me ask another question before we have another audience asking. So could you share some, I mean, you kind of shared, I think, in your presentation, but your experiences in terms of your, diverse professional journey from being a, very, I would say award-winning professor and to being an entrepreneur. So if you want to, a little bit, if you could share a little more on that.
Well, I didn't know what I was.
I mean, the question basically, how it has helped you personally and professionally as an individual now, if you reflect on it.
Yeah, I would, I wish I had a snappy answer. Like I had this, master plan of how I'm going to convert myself from one thing to another, but it really wasn't like that. And I didn't really know what I was doing. And I told you the story that, a VC had said, you better go find yourself a real CEO. That's pretty good advice. Couldn't afford one. So, but I would say it was all ultimately a matter of necessity, that I thought a company needed to exist. And, in order to execute on the vision, and a culture needed to exist in order for the people to be successful. And so all of these things were a set of necessary things. It wasn't, and that's sort of my advice, put one foot in front of the other and do the necessary thing. I like to say that you can get up every morning and have a mantra that you read to yourself in front of a mirror, but mostly you just get to work. You just put one foot in front of the other and you just do that. And then you kind of look over your shoulder and say, oh, look at all that stuff I learned this week. But it's not really a deliberate thing. You say, well, I'm going to have to learn the following 8 things this week. You're reacting to things. The thing that's important, I think, is to develop a sense of self and a sense of culture first, so that you have a framework for making decisions. But in entrepreneurship, you don't know what the next day is going to be, if that helps.
That's so true.
So,
So,
you know.
yes, absolutely. Every day is a new day. That's why, like I said, we enjoy these my stories. Entrepreneurs come, even they've done like number of companies. Every company brings some new nuggets of wisdom, right?
And they're different. I mean, the culture at Sastry 3 was necessarily a safety culture. We handled hazardous materials, and so you had to enforce rules, otherwise people could get hurt. I mean, a jar of something we handled about this big dumped in the HVAC would rub out everybody in the building. So you had to have rules about how you handle things. Amesite is a software company, and we're a fully remote business, so it's like the worst thing that's going to happen to somebody. Maybe somebody gets a paper cut or something. So you don't really have to have a safety culture. It's a different culture. Yeah. And so I'm wary of people saying, here are the operating principles that work for all businesses, because I don't believe that's true. I've run a hardware business and a software business. They're very different. You do have to make a decision, but it's going to be a different decision based on what the organization needs.
Yeah, that's so true. So next question is from Herin Rohela. Thanks for being here, Dr. Marie Sastry. I mean, she said Dr. You had strong founder fit for both of your companies. What advice would you have for someone trying to create a company in a space where she does have as strong a founder fit?
I don't know that anybody has a strong founder fit, honestly, except in retrospect. Because every time you start a new company or even organization, you change as a person. And so afterward, it looks obvious. Oh, well, of course, you had a strong founder fit because you have these following characteristics and your company did these things. It's like, but that's all post facto. I don't know that anybody has a perfect founder fit for what they do. In fact, coming into the private sector as a company focused on learning, couldn't be more different than the approach you would take as an individual professor. As an individual professor, you would be trying to optimize what you teach and make a contribution to the professoriate, to academics, and so forth. You think very differently from the private sector, where you think about serving everybody and being really pedagogically agnostic and not pushing a particular pedagogy or the heuristics therein, but you're trying to serve people to serve anything. So that's just my little example, but I think my advice is don't get intimidated because you don't think you're a perfect fit, because nobody's ever built your business before. Therefore, no one is a fit for it. And your personality and your persona will shape around what the business needs too.
Yeah, no, thank you. So next question is from Dhiraj from Silictronics. Great story. Thank you so much for sharing. Will you start another hardware company in the future? What are lessons for hardware startups or upstart company?
Yeah, I don't know what the future holds. I mean, I'm very, very focused on Amesite. I think it's a great team, a great mission, and we're enjoying a lot of good fortune and success, I would say. In terms of hardware companies, they're just different, right? You do battles with physics every day. And so, in software, one of the nice things is if you can imagine it, you sort of see something out there that looks relatively close, you can go execute it. Hardware is not that way. Physics does not always obey the vision. And so, yeah, but in both cases, you find yourself pivoting, because in software, you're often much more tied to this other thing, which is very random and it has universal constants that you don't control, which is human behavior. So you build something that's executable, and the human beings have to be able to use it and like it. And that's another big X factor. So I don't know that one is so much easier or harder than the other. They're just different, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So next question is from Preeti Padmanabhan. And the question she's asking is, what is your vision for Amesite in next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, thank you, Preeti. We want to be altering the way the world learns. We want people to enjoy learning experiences. So rather than think about coming to a learning experience as a siloed experience where you go into your cave and you are reading, materials and you're by yourself primarily and you're assessed. But to think about learning as an active process where new information is coming into the learning experience at all time, and for that behavior and that experience to become normalized. When I was a professor, I would I was viewed as a very good professor. I'm not sure I ever was, but I did try to bring new materials into the classroom when I was teaching. So I would bring articles and things and say, hey, class, this is what's happening in the world. And this is why we're talking about this today, or whatever, Sastry. But I would try to be persuasive of why what was being covered mattered. The AIs at Amesite are much better than that than I was at all, which is wonderful. So, I could maybe bring in, a couple, 3 articles a week or something like that. I couldn't read 100,000 articles a week or 200 or 300,000 articles a week and curate those that are closest and spur discussions. And then asynchronously, when I was teaching, I couldn't monitor discussions among all of the participants or try to curate those or try to encourage those, but online you can. And so the world becomes very flat and it allows interactions. And so in 3 to 5 years, my fervent hope is that becomes very normative, that education is viewed as a team sport.
Thank you. And by the way, she said great lessons and wanted to thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for joining.
Yeah. And so next question is from Prakash Narayan, and he wanted to see, he says, can you talk about your customer acquisition strategy at Amesite, or how did you acquire your first customer?
Yeah, we just talked to a lot of people and showed them the platform, and it's what they say, like a lot of shoe leather, right? You just because when you're an upstart, you have to overcome all of that skepticism, and it's true. No matter what your credential may be or what success you may have enjoyed, you still have to go through the journey again. And I think if you talk with serial entrepreneurs, they'll tell you the same thing, that the thing that makes the second, third, or fourth one a little bit easier is that you remember how hard the first one was, but it doesn't actually materially make it that easier to sell a solution that hasn't existed before. Our first customer was in California and was a relatively small university that took a shot on us. And so unexpectedly, after closing financing, we had a customer very, very quickly. And so we had to stand up the entire platform in 5 months flat, which we did. And we learned a lot from that. But I can tell you in the first outing, in the first couple of weeks of the courses we were teaching, that the users were not using the platform as we had predicted. So it's sort of like I said, it's like behavioral science versus physics. You're going to hit something as an entrepreneur in software versus hardware. So for a couple of weekends, we stayed up, pretty much a couple of weekends straight and made some revisions and changed them mid in the first 2 weeks of the courses that we were teaching. And the users responded very favorably. And I guess from that, I relearned a lesson, which is if you do the right thing and you're forthright about it, you're probably going to be successful. We didn't try to sweep it under the rug. We didn't try to tell people, no, do it this way. We didn't try to overtrain or anything like that. It was like, well, they aren't doing what we thought they would do. Okay, it's on us to make it better. And that's what we did.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Next question is from Apurva. He says, thank you for the wonderful talk. How does Amesite plan to collect data from university for AI-based improvement? And how does it plan to ensure privacy is maintained for the students?
Yeah, it's a great question. So how we use data is only to improve learning. We do count every click on the platform. We do monitor user behavior on the platform. We use natural language processing, sentiment analysis to understand how people are reacting with the platform and make decisions about what to serve up. Our data policy is very simple. We don't show our data to third parties, and we don't incorporate APIs that do, and we don't sell our data to third parties. So there's nothing about the company business model that that's at odds with that. And we're a software company. We know who we are. So we don't try to offer a free solution and say, well, we'll monetize the data and we'll figure out how to monetize the data later. It's transactional. But obviously everything we do is in support of improving retention on the platform and getting people to engage with each other, because that's why people come.
Okay, thank you. So another question from AGK, our chief volunteer here. So did you raise money from the same VC second time? How is it to run a public company now?
Yeah, it's a great question. No, the first company was VC backed, and it was several VCs, Khosla, General Motors Ventures, Itochu, and then Dyson and Berengia. And the second company, I wanted it to be a public company. So Wall Street bankers, I raised with Wall Street bankers, Laidlaw, and they did a fantastic job. And very different experience, building a company from the beginning, from the outset to be public. Actually, on day one at Amesite, we were a public reporting company, and then did a direct listing onto the NASDAQ less than 3 years later. It was very different, but also very fun.
All right. So next question is from here, one second. Cameron Dixon. When you state you have 98% retention in colleges, can you expand on that? And then if you're a student at a college and they offer a platform like Blackboard, you're forced to use the platform, or are you stating that colleges have 98% retention of students if they use the product?
Yeah, so let me break that down. So on the Amesite platform, across all of our products, it's 98% retention. So that means that after the drop ad period to completion, 98% of the people are still there, which is, we think, a pretty unprecedented number. Colleges, universities, and businesses have all kinds of platforms that they use. We don't require that anyone use our platform exclusively. We have found that our customers like to build out with us, and once they're using the platform, they seem to like to put more stuff on the platform, which is fine, but we don't require exclusivity. For universities, a sweet spot for us is alumni, because if you look at the number of alumni versus matriculated students at most universities, the factor is about 10, except for very young universities, and there aren't too many of those. So there are many, many more alumni than learners. And if you look at the way technology is going, people will not stop being educated at a 4-year degree. In fact, we're, as a society, we're talking about continuous learning now, rather than, a degree program and then you're finished. So the Amesite platform is a good solution for that, because you can read about it on the web if you care to. We have a case study with Wayne State University, which kind of nicely explains how we do things. But they educate a lot of engineers that go to work in the automotive industry. The automotive industry is being disrupted, of course, by autonomous and electric vehicles. And people went to school for things like my degree, like mechanical engineering, and learned about engines and, first and second law of thermodynamics, and not really about electric machines and batteries and power electronics and the like. So having a university like Wayne State, them looking at their alumni and saying, well, what do you need now? Well, it's different things than they learned as an undergraduate, and they don't need another degree necessarily. What they need are 6, 8, 10, 12 week upskilling programs so they can be competitive. So that's what we did with them. And we set them up with a platform that's called Warrior Tech Source. And it's, all branded to Wayne State, and it's been very successful.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So next question I would ask, as someone who has spent his whole life and career adapting to these situations, like in your case, and you have even made your own strides in adapting to a new profession as an entrepreneur and businesswoman. So what advice would you give to today's professionals who are every day dealing with so much uncertainty?
It's a great question. I never have lived through a period. I mean, I guess I'm of a certain age now. I don't think I've ever lived through a period where there wasn't uncertainty. If there was, I probably created uncertainty. Everybody who's on the webinar has a strong proclivity for growth over comfort. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be here in a meeting or a gathering about entrepreneurship. So it's all relative, right? In a recession, there are certain risks, and in boom time there are certain risks. Actually, I think people are more likely to take risks in economically uncertain times, and that's what the data suggests as well. So I started my first company right at the onset of a huge recession, and companies were going bankrupt all around us. I can tell you we took no pleasure in that. A lot of good people and good ideas wound up not seeing light of day, but that is part of the creative destruction of capitalism. And I can tell you that the people at the companies that went bankrupt all went on to do interesting things, and things got built and things got learned. And so that's just part of the process.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, sequel to that question, someone already asked, Bruce Sally, she says, how do you maintain optimism in bad times? That's one. And then second is, what can private sector folks learn from universities?
Yeah, both great questions. How do you keep optimistic in tough times? I think it's very important to plant your flag in the high ground and remember what you came for. I think it's also important to sustain yourself with family and friends. That thinking about yourself as the embodiment of your company is not healthy. You're something besides your company, of course. People are fond of telling startup CEOs, "You are the company," and da da da, and that is fine, but the company is not you. And so making sure that you're sustaining yourself with relationships and you're making time for yourself. Um, I like to do sports and run and lift weights and stuff like that, and that centers me. But whatever you do, whether you meditate or whatever that you practice for self-care, yoga, that's important as well. What does the private sector have to learn from universities? I think there's a lot that the private sector and universities have to learn from one another. They're very, very, very different. In my life, I've had .com, .edu, .gov, and .org email addresses. And anybody who says that somebody will be good at one thing because they've done the other thing, trust me, I have scars and bruises from moving around sectors and relearning how to behaviors and how to conduct yourself and what the objectives are. They're very different. What the private sector can learn from universities are commitment to higher purpose, and patience and doggedness. I think that people inside a university will work for decades on a problem that may seem very small to the outside world, but ultimately produce a paper or two that changes the course of technology often. So a great deal about patience and a great deal about acceptance of differences, because tenure in general keeps people in an organization and in a protected class. And so you have to be patient with bureaucracy because no one really has to move. It's the bias to action is much lower. From the private sector point of view, universities can learn a lot. Not being accepting of processes that don't work, being focused on outcomes, I think is very important. And making efforts to achieve the good over the perfect is something that the private sector does very well. In fact, if you look at the pandemic, it was really the private sector that kept the economy running with SaaS businesses. The SaaS businesses really can take a lot of credit for saving lives, because merely maybe 5-10 years ago, Naveen and everyone AGK, I mean, you know this, that it wouldn't have been possible to move so much of society's functions online, but because of the rise and the prevalence of SaaS businesses, it was. And so a lot of society did not have to make the decision, do I risk contracting the virus, or do I give up my economic viability? Large swaths of society didn't have to make that decision. Now, of course, the virus and the pandemic are extremely tragic, and there were many parts of society that were left behind. But I would say that if anything, the private sector's step up during the pandemic is only going to accelerate technology. And the imperative that we have now is to make sure that large sections of society don't get left behind. I think that there is a bit of a canard that people are not going to be able to keep up with technology changes, and perhaps they will have to be paid to just exist and so forth. My reading of history suggests that that's nonsense. I mean, people moved from subsistence to farming to the industrial age and learned far more difficult behaviors than learning to use platforms and digitalization. But it is incumbent upon us, and it's one of the reasons I started this company, to bring people along and make sure people have the right learning so that they can participate in this more digitalized world.
Yeah, thank you, Anne-Marie. So I have two more questions, unless someone asked before we wind up. So one thing I was interested in, having you share your thoughts. How do you see impact of this online education market now impacting the traditional classroom-based education, which is obviously very expensive, because in US, this education market, I think, is very expensive for lots of folks. Going forward, do you think that may change, since, from your experience as a university professor in the physical environment to now online education and your own company?
Well, there are a few competing factors. One is that the online experience during pandemic was done principally on old platforms, which did not provide a great user experience and was very disappointing to people. And the reality is, for younger children, the online is not the best way. Children do need to be together, but for professional education, it may be the only way practically to upskill. So our needs for education and the appropriateness of delivery change as we grow up in age and so forth. The pandemic, we think, indelibly left professional education as an online activity, just like music is indelibly an online activity. Shopping is indelibly an online activity. We think that will not change, because when you think about people who are upskilling and people who are learning, we have other obligations. We have many people who most critically need to upskill are in part of their lives where they're responsible for parents or children or other parts of society. It's not practical to say, every Tuesday and Thursday, I'm going to, drive down to some warehouse experience and sit and look at a lonely figure in front of a podium talk at me. It's not reasonable. It's much more reasonable, in fact, more efficacious for people to interact online and actually engage with one another and form relationships, which is how people are engaging anyway, whether it's from dating to music to shopping to social media. So that we think will be absolutely an indelible change. In terms of undergraduate education, like I said, there's widespread dissatisfaction with the experience because fundamentally something that was designed to be an on-ground experience in the main was forced online, and some weaknesses showed, not just in the denial of some of the things that we do on ground at universities, but also fissures showed in our digital backbone, which was relatively weak. And so, what the future we believe will be better SaaS platforms, including we believe Amesite's, and we're very optimistic about our chances of becoming a larger disruptor, because regardless of whether a learning experience is online or on ground, it requires a digital backbone. The bottom line is that people will no longer accept, a drive or a storage device for anything as a replacement for a good AI-driven SaaS platform. That we are not going backward, and that is an indelible change.
That's so true. Thank you. So last question is, I want to quote one quote from you when I think you said at the opening event of GM's Global Battery Test Lab. So one piece of advice I think you shared was you need to stand where the ball is going to be, not where the ball is. So with that, what I wanted to ask you was any words of wisdom for aspiring entrepreneurs and any trends and opportunities that you see, where the ball is going to be if they had to start a company today in the future of education.
Well, that was borrowed from Gordie Howe, who stood where the puck was going to be, not where the puck is. So I got to give credit where credit is due. Advice for aspiring entrepreneurs is don't take failure too hard. You're going to do a lot of things that are right that everybody tells you are crazy. You're going to do a bunch of things wrong that people said you were crazy and they were right. That's okay. It doesn't really matter how many times you fall down. You just got to get up one more time. And I know that's very generic advice, but it is very practical. What they say, sometimes you get the bear, some days the bear gets you. And I think keeping your sense of humor is my second piece of advice. Just keep your sense of humor about you. Recognize, step back from it and say, it's not the end of the world. I had a lousy pitch, or I had a bad result in the lab today, or somebody didn't like my face when I pitched, or some customer told me to go pound sand, whatever it is. Try to keep your sense of humor and keep, finally, third piece of advice is keep the numbers in mind. Okay, it's difficult to be successful in starting new organizations, and you will fail more than you succeed. So try not to be too surprised at it. Play the odds. Of course, I'm going to more or less apply mathematicians. I'm going to say that, but play the odds. If you have a day where you say 8 things failed, but 1 thing went right, it's a pretty good day at the office. So keep the numbers in mind and play the odds.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. So with that, we'd like to give you a virtual round of applause, big applause. And thank you again for being here this evening. I know it's probably it's like 10 o'clock in Michigan right now.
Yeah.
So have a wonderful night. And thank you, everyone, attendees. Thank you again for joining us. And we'll see you next month's my story, we have Blue Jeans founder speaking on, I think, May 16th. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Yep, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.